This tour of the virtual exhibition, First Fragments, Biblical Papyrus from Roman Egypt, has been designed as a resource for teachers and students of religious education. The tour will highlight objects relating to the development of a sacred text, sources of evidence for the historical Jesus and the early Christian communities, and the search for meaning through symbolic language and objects. Before exploring specific objects, let us first learn about the significance of this exhibition for students of religious education. Many of the earliest known copies of the text that would become the Christian Bible were discovered in Egypt. The fragments preserved in the Chester Beatty Museum and in this display date from the 2nd to the 4th century AD. At that time, Egypt was part of the Roman Empire. Followers of Jesus had spread their new teachings throughout the empire, including to Egypt. The texts are written in Greek, a language that was commonly used throughout the Roman Empire, and they are written on papyrus, a type of writing material made from the papyrus plant, which grows on the banks of the Nile. Today, there are fewer than 300 fragments of biblical papyrus manuscripts dating to before the 4th century that are known to exist. Most of these books are not complete. 11 of these fragmentary manuscripts are represented in this display. Individual pages are mounted between sheets of glass, so you will see many more than 11 objects on display. Now let us enter the exhibition and look at some papyrus fragments that will allow us to explore three key ideas: production and spread, discoveries and canon, and searching for meaning. Production and spread. The Chester Beatty Biblical Papyri don't just reveal the words of the books the early Christians were sharing with each other. They also tell us about how these books were made. These first two sections in this corner here, and further down the room in these cases here, focus on bookmakers and scribes. And in these first two cases in the corner of the room, you will see the development of the codex. A codex is the book format we are most used to today. A set of folded pages with stitching down one side to form a spine. And you see two models here in these cases, this one and a second one, which demonstrates a more sophisticated bookmaking format, both of which have been made by our conservation department based on evidence from fragments like these in the cases here and others from our collection. When you have time, you should come back and go in for a close look at some of the objects here, where you will see things like the evidence of folding down the center of the pages, as well as evidence of stitch holes and other evidence which helps us to understand the different ways that books were constructed. At the next section, we'll learn about the scribes who copied out these texts. Let's go in for a close look at this fragment. Here we see the end of the letter to the Hebrews and the beginning of the first letter to the Corinthians. When we zoom in here and look at the title, you might recognize this Greek alpha because it looks a bit like an A, and that means one in this title, so first letter to the Corinthians. However, what we're really interested in here is this note just under the bottom of the text of Hebrews, which says stick pasai, and that's not part of the letter or part of the biblical text. Stikoi can refer to verses, rows, or lines of text, and they were used by scribes to measure out how much they had copied. Pasai, which you see here, is a symbol for the number 700. So in other words, by the end of writing out the text of the Hebrews, this scribe was letting their employer know that they expected to be paid for 700 stikoi. In the next papyrus fragment, we'll see an example of how scribes dealt with mistakes. Here you can see a line of text which is floating up at the top of the page, separate from the main body of the text. And to the left, you see this symbol, which looks a bit like an anchor. On this page, the scribe accidentally left out the short phrase, which was later inserted at the top of the page. And then the symbol identifies for the reader where the missing text should be inserted. Going forward to the readers section, we'll find some evidence of how these texts were spread. You might find it interesting to look up a translation of the passage on display here. In this extract from the book of Acts, St. James mentions how Jewish people around the Roman Empire would gather on the Sabbath in their cities and read the law of Moses out loud to each other. We know Christians also began to read their texts publicly so that people could hear the teachings. And in some of these examples, we'll see some visual aids that were added to help readers. In these examples, you can see that scribes did not put gaps between words at this point in history. However, there are some dots or breathing marks here which show the beginning of the separation of text, where you might find commas, colons, and full stops today. And today, biblical texts are divided with chapter and verse numbers to better locate sections of scripture. But as you see here, they were not part of the original text. In this next example, we see how horizontal black lines were used to mark the separation between paragraphs. And in another example here, we see how titles were used to divide different texts within the same manuscript. This is the second letter to the Corinthians, and you might be able to see here a Greek beta or a B, which means two, or second letter to the Corinthians. When St. Paul originally wrote these letters to the community at Corinth and to other cities, there was no need to be adding headings. But by the 3rd and 4th century, letters written by St. Paul and some other important leaders were deemed to contain teachings that were useful for all Christian believers. So copies of the letters were collected together. And in collections of letters like this, headings are very useful to readers. Now let us move on to the topic of discoveries and canon. We have learned a little about the production and spread of these early Christian texts. So let us think about the importance of archaeological discoveries in the development of a sacred text. The word canon refers to the set of texts or books that are accepted as being genuine by a religious group. When Sir Alfred Chester Beatty acquired these papyri in the 1930s, they gave scholars great insight into what the early Christians considered to be important texts. Here we're going to move into the collectors section of the exhibition. And here we learn that when papyrus manuscripts were uncovered by Egyptians in the early 20th century, they were sold to antiquities dealers based in cities, who would then sell them on to European and American collectors. Fragments of early biblical texts were particularly attractive to these collectors. Pages of manuscripts often got separated by dealers and sold to different collectors in order to maximize profit, or sometimes simply as a result of not understanding the text. This object was initially sold to a man called Merton, and you can see his name on the sticker on the glass mount here. But in 1957, Chester Beatty bought Merton's papyrus collection, and in so doing, he reunited that fragment with some other fragments that had been part of the page sold to Chester Beatty in 1930. Collections like this and others around the world also allow scholars to compare and contrast early versions of the biblical texts. Take this text from 1 Corinthians 16. It mentions Prisca or Priscilla and Aquila, who are a couple that helped St. Paul in his mission to found churches, like the one at Corinth in Greece, and to spread the Christian gospel. In this fragment at Chester Beatty, a sigma or an S has been added to the end of Prisca's name, which is a masculine ending in Greek. This might be a simple mistake by the scribe, or it might have been a scribe who thought women could or should not play the important leading role that this woman had in the early Christian community. However, by comparing this papyrus with other surviving manuscripts and fragments, which preserve this same section of the text, scholars know that Prisca was a woman. This shows the importance of every piece of biblical papyrus for establishing the authority of the sources that scholars use when they are studying the historical Jesus and the early Christian communities. Finally, we turn to searching for meaning. We are now going to turn to the content of these texts. As we have already seen, there are interesting clues about the life and the world of the early Christians contained within these texts. We will focus on a few objects that show how the language of symbol was used by these communities in their search for meaning. And we're going to look at the items on this top shelf in detail. One item on exhibition is this small cylinder seal from the time of the Assyrian Empire, making it roughly 9 to 1200 years older than the papyri on display. A genre called the chaos combat myth was a common way that ancient Near Eastern cultures expressed their fear of danger and their hope that divine help would come in these times of danger. When the seal is rolled in soft clay, an impression of the hero Ninurta pursuing this monster Anzu with its wings here appears in the clay. Later on, in Jewish and Christian culture, imagery of monsters being defeated also helped people to understand their experiences of suffering and their hope that God would help. From that papyrus on the left-hand side on that top shelf, we see a Greek translation of the book of the prophet Daniel, where he has a vision of 4 monsters, a lioness, a leopard, a bear, and a beast coming out of a great sea. And each beast is associated with a different empire: Babylonia, Media, Persia, and Macedonia. We'll zoom in here now to one word, Arku. It looks a little like it might do in English letters, but this P has an R sound in Greek, and this Y has a U sound. So try to remember this word, Arku. It's the word for bear, and you're about to see it again in the next text from the New Testament book of Revelation, which was on the right-hand side of that shelf. And in this text from Revelation here, we see a passage that describes a beast that is a combination of animals and of other beasts, including the same kinds of animals as were mentioned in the Daniel passage. And if we look close to the top here, just about 3 lines down, we can see Arku, the word for bear again. These kinds of texts gave hope and meaning to early Christians who were waiting for God's help as they experienced persecution in the days of the Roman Empire. Another place where we can see symbolic language being used to express a search for meaning is on this Christian amulet. An amulet is an object believed to have healing powers or protective powers. We'll go in for a closer look here. And we can see these folding marks where the papyrus is really worn away. And the folding marks would suggest that this item was carried around as an amulet. Here we also see a Christogram, or a symbol for Christ. Christos is the Greek word for Christ, And the first two letters are chi, which looks like an X, which you can see here, and rho, which we actually saw in Arku. It's a P, it looks like a P in English, but it has an R sound in Greek. And you can see that there's a little bird nibbling on this combined chi-rho symbol for Christ. And when we zoom out a little further, we also see that there's a serpent here as his head, but a serpent in a circle eating its own tail. And the letters around here are a common magical palindrome, or something that can be read forward and backwards. So this shows that early Christians were worshipping Christ and that they felt his name and his symbol would offer them protection. So they were incorporating their belief in Christ with other beliefs as they tried to understand the meaning and purpose of life. That brings us to the conclusion. Thank you for joining us on this virtual tour of First Fragments, Biblical Papyrus from Roman Egypt. We hope that this tour has helped you to see the relevance of this virtual exhibition for religious education. And we strongly encourage you to visit online in your own time and to look at the rest of the objects in much more detail.